All right, Mr. Chairman, we're live.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Select Federal Resources and Committee. Appreciate everyone being here. We're delighted West Wyoming Community College in Springs, Wyoming. Thank you for everyone that's traveled. We welcome you to Rock Springs. The order of business is the committee chairman. We're both representing the State House, well, the Senate. So what we'd like to do is open it up for nominations right now.
Mr. Chairman, we need to take a roll call.
Roll call first.
Senator Ellis. Senator Kolb.
Present.
Representative Tarver.
Present.
Representative Winter.
Here.
Senator Boner.
Here.
Representative Heiner.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Okay, now we open it up. Then we would- Here we approve nomination. Yeah, nomination. Closing nominations. You need to have a all vote. So then we take the questions.
Senator Ellis. Senator Kolb.
Everybody.
This is for both of them, unless the chair would like to do for each. Representative Tarver. Representative Winter. Senator Boner. Representative Heiner. All right, we have elected Senator Boner and Representative Heiner as the co-chairman of the select committee.
Appreciate your support. Someone take the morning session and. Today we have a full slate of testimony. We will have public comment after each testimony and any other legislators or other thoughts during the.
My name is Deborah Wilkinson. I'm from Deb, and I am a deputy regional forester in the Intermountain Region.
You're from Ogden, Utah.
Just wanted to share, well, first off, again, thank you for those who live in the community surrounding them. Always felt the opportunity. So I wanted to share just a few things with regard to some planning efforts that are underway because it may influence some of the other topics and our ability to affect change in those. So there are a number of conservation topics that are underway. The 15th Farm National Forest Initiative and so they are looking at they're going to have doing an assessment of like ecological, social, and economic conditions. That assessment will be published this fall. And then plan revision process typically years. They will be identifying operating agencies and other partners. Actually, National Forest public their forest plan revision, and with them and their final environmental impact statements. And that plan originally dated from 1986. And so there obviously been change conditions that have been affected. We've done that in partnership. And Sue it by COP, the forest supervisor there has done that in cooperation with a number of partners in the state of Wyoming. The governor's policy office, Sweetwater County, Sweetwater Conservation District, Sweetwater Conservation District, and Wayne County.
Been actively involved in that plan revision. So hopefully you'll have seen some change there that would be positive.
And so that the plan will get continues there and address homes and recreation that are emerged.
A lot of things weren't going on that, such as
and then most of the current charting is directed in the state of Idaho. However, unfortunately, it is in Wyoming and Vancouver.
They work with the Grand Targhee Resort, which is located on the border of Wyoming, and they're working to analyze the resort's proposed expansion, which could have impacts to communities in Wyoming. And the CT is finalizing a environmental impact statement for the proposed Crow Creek pipeline. And communities to act in and start out. So just some change.
The welfare pricing strategy was a big topic that we were invited to address today. In January 2022, the mission to attend
the wildfire crisis in the places where it poses the most risk to communities and poses the most threats to communities. As part of that strategy, the Eastern States.
One of the reasons wildfire crisis is
high risk firesheds spread to communities.
The 21 wildfire crisis strategy landscapes,
however, are only part of the wildfire crisis strategy.
And 218 fire sheds across the United States, and 3 of those are in of course, there was understanding that there are other high-risk areas outside of these fire sheds and other fires for about 250,000 acres. Because we recognize that there are other efforts
that need treatment, and we're doing our best to target resources to protect critical infrastructure and natural resources. Projects.
We're focused on all of them. The Bridger Teton National Forest recently finalized a 10-year vegetation management plan, and that was done in cooperation with trying to identify the area that shared
it's most important to invest.
We know that we have to continue to get treatments in order to protect communities. Over 100,000 acres of the National Forest in Wyoming in FY 21 and 22, and that's all of the forests across the state. Any of these treatments were mechanical, which
for communities surrounding them as they went in and would do the mechanical treatments on those lands to reduce risk. And 60% of those activities occur in protection plans to reduce risk to vulnerable communities.
We're also investing through state and private forestry, which gives money directly to the states in order to accomplish work programs. For example, there was a second round of community wildfire events. At the second round of community wildfire events, grant opportunities for planning. The grants which were authorized under the
Inflation Reduction Act provide $1 million directly intended to help communities impact the and mitigate wildfire.
And in addition to investing in more,
We're also working
strengthening
on,
the industry, we also cover. For example, in partnership with the National Wild Turkey Federation, we're participating in timber transit pilot project with surplus wild timber from California to Maine and industry, in
Pullet, Wyoming.
and then Wyoming also
Received 500,000 in community wood grants to promote innovation in wood products and renewable wood energy economies. This includes 190,000 in fuel reduction grants in Mountain View and Thane, and 300,000 in grant money to support mill upgrades in Hulett. And of particular interest to Senator Ellis, effective for underserved populations within our region. Strategy. Answer any questions you all might have.
Director, Open Committee, questions for the Deputy Director? Senator Boner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you mentioned specific what these grants are used for in Hewlett with the upgrading the mills. Are there any other examples of what these grants are used for? I mean, in my mind, the solution is pretty simple. You just allow for more opportunities for forest management with the private sector. And, so I guess I'm a little lost as to what the grants are for, except, and how's that work? How's that private public partnership work? Just maybe a little bit more detail there.
Yeah. Sorry. Thank you. There are a number of different grant programs. And so some of them, this one was a wood innovations grant. And so that grant is specifically targeted to helping industry in those in specific areas. They write out proposals and then based on the criteria are ranked out and funds are awarded. We do have other funds that go directly to states or to communities. For example, those wildfire community defense grants, a community would submit a proposal, which, we're happy to work in partnership with them to help prepare. And then that money would come to them to allow them to address the specific items that they line out as needed to be done to protect their community. So we know that, they live there, they understand what are the most imminent risks. And so those proposals come from the communities and then the funding would come from the government.
Any other questions? Deputy Director Okenson, I've got a couple of questions. We've seen some of the proposals to reduce fire risk in California and some of the other states, but here in Wyoming, we're not seeing. I haven't seen much of a progressive idea what you're going to do to reduce some of these fire risks. I've been in Jackson when the fire is raging to the south, and we were poised to evacuate the town because of the fire risk. Fortunately, the wind shifted and it didn't proceed to where it got into the town. But we have a number of towns that are in proximity of the forest, and I see in other states where you're reducing that fire risk by harvesting some of the timber, bringing it to Hewlett to process. I appreciate that very much, but are there any plans here in Wyoming to reduce some of the undergrowth, reduce some of the old forest growth around these surrounding communities that are at risk?
Absolutely. Thank you. So as I mentioned, the Bridger-Teton National Forest developed that 10-year vegetation management strategy in cooperation with the counties. And that plan, what we're doing is trying to accelerate implementation of that plan. So we're looking for opportunities from all of the different funding mechanisms that we have at our disposal. The money might not be coming from the Inflation Reduction Act, which has some pretty specific controls on areas where it can be used, but through regular appropriations, which then aren't necessarily needed in those other places because they're being funded through the other bills, we're able to fund work directly in the areas of other places where they're needed. And so I recognize that the priority landscapes are just a portion of the wildfire crisis strategy. the chief was very clear when he spoke with Congress that this was a down payment on the work that was needed. And so they identified those 21 areas, but they are not by any means all of the areas that need to be treated. So we are doing our best to focus, and I understand the governor is meeting with the chief next week, and I'm sure this will be a topic of conversation of how do we invest in the state of Wyoming to ensure that the communities here are protected and the watersheds here are protected as well.
Appreciate that you're working on that and recognizing that we also have some communities that are at risk. Follow-up question to that. We've seen a lot of devastation and air quality issues because of the wildfires up in Canada. So not only do we have communities that are at risk, we have forests that could impact us regionally and throughout the whole nation during wildfire season, which we are approaching right now. And I recognize that it takes a long time for timber sale to go about. Would it be more expeditious if we utilize this fire risk versus a timber sale to be able to harvest some of this timber that could be put to beneficial use throughout the forest? I know it takes years and years and sometimes decades to reach an actual harvest of timber products. Is there other avenues that we should be pursuing rather than an organized harvest utilizing the fire risk strategy?
Thank you. And yes, absolutely. So as part of the wildfire crisis strategy, there's an acknowledgement that much of the wood that's out there isn't really viable for commercial use at this point. And so we, while we acknowledge the importance of timber, we also recognize the billions of dollars that can be caused in damage to infrastructure and communities. And so we are doing mechanical treatments that I mentioned earlier, where they go in and they will, just cut the stuff down. Often they'll put the trees out for, if they can sell it, great. If they can't, then, we just deal with that. We follow through with prescribed burns, which are burns that are conducted under very controlled circumstances to create fuel and fire breaks so that we have a defensible space in order to be able to stop a fire should it occur. So we're looking at the full range of treatments, and there's acknowledgement and some new authorities that have come to us that allow us to, not necessarily have to achieve a profit in terms of a timber sale, even so that we can get some of that wood out of there, even using some federal funds, because we're considering it primarily a fuels treatment and not a timber sale.
Thank you, Chairman. Director, I have two questions, and they're probably two different things, but first one is when you talk about, the issue we have with fire, the fuel out there. I know we all use platitudes and we speak to government folks, but I'd really like to know the percentage of change you think you can make to decrease that fuel load, instead of, oh, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're trying all these things. Okay, this is a big issue. So I'd like to hear from you if you've got any numbers. Maybe you can get back to the committee about what these numbers are, but how much percent of change of an improvement you forecast you can make? That was the first question. Second question is the California wildfires that drastically affect us here in a very negative way. Is there anything your partners are doing over there? I realize California, hopefully thankful of that. But what are y'all doing to try to deal with this? Forget Canada, that's another country. But what are we doing in California to try to stop this? Because it is drastically having an impact here on our quality of life living in Southwest. Well, certainly here, I'm sure it impacts the whole state in a negative way. But what could you have shed some light on that second question also? Thank you.
Deputy Director.
Thank you. So with regard to the number of acres that we believe we can treat, I would need to check and get back to you with absolute numbers. The goal of the wildfire crisis strategy is in each of those high-risk fire sheds, which are approximately 250,000 acres, to treat 20 to 40% of the fuels in that area. And that's what scientifically has been shown will actually decrease the risk of a catastrophic wildfire impacting communities. It would give us a foothold to be able to respond to it. So we can definitely get back to you with plans on what's intended to be treated in terms of the amount. With regard to California, I live in Utah and I absolutely understand what you're saying about air quality. We suffer from that as well. We look at the wildfire crisis strategy as a national issue. So as we have teams, like I mentioned, the prescribed fire tool, we will often send our experts over to other states to be able to treat areas that have been indicated to be of critical importance. We're trying to, as an agency, prioritize some of those areas where they feel like there's the greatest risk. Sorry. The hope is that, by identifying what those areas we believe are the highest risk and going in and being able to do treatments using the resources of the agency, not just the resources of the Region 5, which is the, what do we call it? The Southwestern or Pacific Southwest region, not just using their resources, but resources from across the country to treat those areas, recognizing that it does have huge impacts. And just on a side note, the smoke from the California fires has now been impacting the East Coast as well. And so hopefully there'll be a better understanding for what we live through here in the West every year. So.
Any other questions? Representative Winter.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ma'am, I appreciate the things that the Forest Service is proposing. We need to work on this, these threats before it becomes a fire. However, it's been my experience of lately, especially that the Forest Service and most government agencies seem like that they are too slow to move on a fire. And from what I understand also, it's because of, they say safety is their concern. But when you're going to move on a fire, you've got to move quick. And these people that have hired on to fight fires, they understand that, and they're willing to go at the beginning and get something done. And that is not happening. And so with all of your good intentions relative to stopping fires before they ever start, we need to do something to stop these things if they do start, and do it very quickly, because otherwise it just takes off and then it costs millions of dollars and lots of problems with air quality and so forth, as you know. So I would just hope that you could express to your supervisors or the people in charge that they need to reevaluate the safety thing and be more objective in attacking these fires, because otherwise it's never going to change. So thank you.
There's an analysis that's done, and firefighter safety does come into play. But if we make the decision not to suppress a fire, there's a requirement that they brief up to the regional office, to my boss, Mary Farnsworth, our regional forester, or me or one of the other deputy regional foresters, to look at to our fire and aviation management program, as well as to the regional forester.
Director, we're approaching fire season here in the West right now. Are you having enough staffing that you will be able to handle with the growth in the wet spring we've had? We're naturally going to have a robust fire season. Do you have any concerns about staffing for the fire season?
Thank you. So with regard to staffing, I think it's been pretty widely in the news that we struggle at times to attract firefighters. The pay and the benefits aren't necessarily competitive with some of the other options that are out there in industry. However, we believe this year that we have sufficient resources. We pull on the resources across the entire region and across the nation. And so we met last week with the governor and announced our intentions for fire season. And we believe that we are well staffed and prepared to be able to respond to that. We respond to fire also as an interagency community that includes states and local fire departments, as well as the BLM, the Forest Service, whatever resources are out there, we bring to bear when there's a fire. So we believe that we are well prepared at this point.
Senator Tarver.
Chairman, thank you. Thanks, Deb, for your testimony. And I'd really like to ask, I got a couple of questions. The primary source of our problem, is it excessive fuel?
Deputy Director.
Yes, we have gone through a period of time where there have not been sufficient resources to treat all of the lands that needed to be treated. And for, decades going past, we didn't allow fire to fulfill a natural role in the ecosystem. And so that allowed fuels to build up to the point where we can have a catastrophic wildfire.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So follow up to that would be, I'm not going to throw you under the bus, but your predecessors perhaps maybe should have had a little more proactive in management of the fuel by allowing back burns, allowing forestry to come in and deforest perhaps. Is this something that we're looking at in the future, is perhaps being more proactive and thinning down the forest before it becomes a problem and then we have another problem to fix, and because the problem we created in the first, you don't see where I'm going with this.
Director.
Thank you. Yes. So one of the things that we're talking with Kelly Norris, the acting state forester, about is implementing shared stewardship, which means that we would come together with the state, the counties, other interested parties. We would identify shared areas that we believe are at risk, and that we would develop a plan together to treat those. And those may span, federal land, they may be state land, they may be private lands. But our intent is just that, to bring the entire community together, to focus on those areas that we know are high risk, and to be able to treat those, whether it's, like you say, through backburns or mechanical treatments or whatever the tools are at our disposal. So we are very amenable to that.
Chairman, I'll try to ask a question this time. I'm curious, does the Forest Service ever have any thoughts or concerns about the policies that occur in the wilderness areas relative to fires? I refer to the fires of '88, Yellowstone and Ridge of Teton and so forth. I operated in there for many, many years, and right now, after those fires, the timber is just falling in, and the trails are blocked, and it just makes more work and costs more money to the Forest Service. When I think they could go in there and harvest a lot of that burnt timber, maybe too late now, I don't know. But in the future, I would think that we could maybe try to make some arrangements or changes to the Wilderness Act, and to where you can use helicopters to harvest timber and so forth. Or do you have any thoughts relative to that and where this might go?
Thank you. So as you're very well aware, if you operated in the wilderness, that we do have the Wilderness Act, and that requires any time that we're going to take action in the wilderness that we do a minimum requirements analysis, and that we minimize to the extent that we can any kind of mechanical or other intervention in the wilderness to maintain its character. So in order to, we do watch if a fire were to ignite in the wilderness to make sure if it does pose a risk to a community or something else, we would go in and suppress at that point. But yes, it would require changes to legislation to enable us to go in and do things like harvest using mechanical and helicopters and other means.
Any other questions for the Deputy Director? Senator Boner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we've spent a little bit of time here talking about fuels management, and I'm just wondering if you could share your perspective on the Good Neighbor Authority that you have with the state forester and what the status of that program is. I know we had a bill about 3 or 4 years ago that authorized 1 full-time position for part-time or at-will positions, I should say. I'm just wondering what your assessment of that program is, that state program, and whether it's operating well, whether it could be expanded, in particular, but just your general thoughts would be helpful as well.
Thank you. So yes, the Good Neighbor Authority is a tremendous tool and we're definitely using that. I believe we have one Good Neighbor forester on the Bridger Teton, and I believe there are 3 in other parts of the state, as well as a position in the acting state forester's office that we use to coordinate that work. It's been a tool that has worked well. You know, the state basically is, it sounds like you're very familiar with it, but the state basically hires the resource and the federal government provides the funding. It helps to get us integrated into the work going on the ground and to understand the concerns of the state and the locality that they're working in. And often at times we're not as agile as what the state can be. And so it does help us to bring in very talented people in a way that we might not otherwise be able to do.
Senator Boner.
So in terms of Bridger Teton, you said you have 1 at will. Would you be able to fund 2 if the opportunity arose? I guess how many would you have more? Would you be able to fund more, and if so, how many in Bridger Teton specifically?
Thank you. That is a great question. As you know, our budgets fluctuate from year to year. And so it's something we could certainly take a look at. Are there other opportunities to invest? And I think through that shared stewardship strategy, that will give us an opportunity statewide to take a look at where those kinds of positions would make sense and could make the greatest difference. So I think it's something we're certainly open to, but would need to do some analysis to understand.
Senator Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Deputy Director, I just want to state my question. I'm worried that it's turned into something else. So out of all managed lands, acreages in the state of Wyoming, that's wilderness, everything, what percentage of impact do you plan on making to improve the situation for fire level? That was my, if that's more clear, I hope. Thank you.
Deputy Director Robeson.
Thank you for clarifying that. We will get those numbers. I can tell you that nationally, they're in an effort right now to identify 5-year vegetation management plans. And so those plans are being updated and developed right now. So we should be able to give you a sense of that.
Any other questions from the committee? Seeing none, Deputy Director Okeson, I'll let you catch your breath while we have public comments. Appreciate your time and efforts here on the hot seat. We recognize Representative Prentice. Any comments that you would like to make, Representative Knapp? All right, we'll open it up for public testimony. Any agencies that would like to testify on wildfire risk and strategy? Seeing none, any public that wants to testify on this topic? Emily, do we have any remote? Seeing no comments, I guess you're back on the hot seat again.
I don't know how you want to handle it. You want to go through all the Forest Service topics, but before we start having committee discussion, but this committee can sponsor bills that deal with, federal land management. So at your discretion, Mr. Chairman, I think we might want to consider increasing the number of authorized positions in the state forester's office. And I see Deputy Crowder's here, not to put you on the spot or anything, but that does fall under state lands. But at very least, it'd be a very simple bill draft, just inserting 6 or 8 or wherever the case may be, for our next meeting, and we could, consider whether we need to build upon the program. Sounds like it's been very successful and a useful tool in the toolbox. And sounds like we already have all 4 positions filled. We may need some more, especially if they're federally funded, I guess. I don't know. We'll see. But it allows us to work more closely with our federal partners, and as the deputy director stated, work more agilely than perhaps they can, using exclusively federal means. And so I think there's a lot of value in the program because we do get that flexibility and that cooperation. So whatever you want, Mr. Chairman, but I think that's something that the committee should consider.
Thank you, Co-Chair Boner. Deputy Director Crowder, would you like to comment on this idea and maybe give us some feedback how this good neighbor position has functioned and whether it's got some bumps in the road or what kind of things you would recommend for the audience?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jason Crowder, Deputy Director for the Office of State Lands and Investments. Appreciate the question. I don't know if I have specific details on the exact amount of effort and positive work that's come out of this program. However, the reports that Ms. Norris, our interim state forester, has given us are very positive. It is truly putting boots on the ground and moving timber out of areas where we've been restricted, not only from a commercial sense, but from a fire protection sense as well. So it's been an extremely positive program, and anything that we could do to further enhance that program by getting more bodies out into the specific forested areas across the state, I think we would be extremely appreciative of and would move forward if that was the committee's desire. But I'm happy to answer any other further questions if you have them.
Cold.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Deputy Director Crowder, specifically, I mean, I'm new to this, what these folks actually do. The people that we interact with the federal government on the state forestry side of things. What exactly will more people do for us? I mean, what is a direct benefit that the state would see from if the ability exists for us to bring on more people to interact with the federal agencies?
Deputy Director Crowder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I don't know if I can give you specifics. We can have a report prepared for you at the next meeting to see what the benefits could be from those. This isn't a program that I'm directly tied with, so I apologize for that, but happy to provide a report on what more boots on the ground, more people in the field would provide to the state. It is a statewide benefit. It's not just a state trust land benefit. So it's a very broad beneficial impact.
Any other questions for the Deputy Director? Thank you, Mr. Crowder, for being here and responding quickly. So, Co-Chair Boner, do we have a motion that you would like to entertain at this time then?
Move that we have a bill drafted for our next meeting that expands the number of at-will contract employees from 4 to 10 for now, and we'll have a discussion as to what the right number is, but let's just say 10. And keep in mind, these are federally funded positions. That's in the current statute, and that's in 36-1-503, if anybody wants to look at it. So that's the motion, just strike 4, insert 10.
Thank you, Co-Chairman Boner. We have a second by Senator Cole. Any discussion? Representative Tarver.
Chairman, I'm a little reluctant to throw more tax dollars at something that tax dollars have caused the problem. I'm just a little hesitant to always go down that road. I mean, we create a problem and then we immediately throw more assets towards fixing the problem we created. I just have a hard time swallowing that pill. That's all I gotta say.
Senator Cole.
Mr. Co-Chair. Yeah, on that point, this issue is a federal issue, and I think and I do agree that using, printed money isn't the brightest idea in the world, but the reality is that's what we have to work with. And ignoring it doesn't make this problem better for the state of Wyoming. So I'm certainly up for a bill draft, debate this further, and this is not a final bill draft, it's just the beginning of a bill draft. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Comments? Seeing none, sensing your desire to vote, all those in favor of drafting a bill to increase the number of good neighbor representatives. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? No. That motion carries. So Emily and Talise would. Okay. All right. Now we'll move on to our second topic, off-road trails. Deputy Director Okeson, would you like to proceed with that topic?
Thank you. And I'm not sure that I have as much to say on this one, but happy to entertain as many questions as I can. So the Intermountain region is committed to maintaining access to our national forests. And this includes many groups of users that want to access our public lands, including hunters, anglers, bikers, hikers, motorized vehicle use. The Intermountain region hosts more than 1,950 miles of roads open to motorized use, which includes the use of UTV and ATV motorcycles and e-bikes. And we understand that there's a House Bill 42, and that bill should have little to no impact on the Forest Service trail systems because we currently require all off-road operators to follow state law. And the Forest Service concurs with the safety features for motorcycles and off-road vehicles mandated by Senate File 17. We don't see a negative impact of either act.
Thank you, Deputy Director. Any Senator Cole, please.
Co-chair, Deputy Director, particularly I had a question about the width regulations because I was looking through the map and frankly, I didn't realize there was a 62 inch, 64 inch vehicle restriction on certain roads, plus 50 plus vehicles of, it's not restricted, I guess. Is there a reason why, that we have a 50 inch limitation on a lot of these trails? I drive on them myself and I haven't been dodging timber. The trails generally weave around wherever they go, but there's a safety issue, I guess is my point. There's a safety issue with this. If you can get in there with some sort of motorized vehicle, you can probably, so I'd like to know, can we change that from 50 to 72 inches or some other number besides 50? But is there a way that we can change that? Yes, no. I guess I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on that, Deputy Director.
Deputy.
Good question. I don't know why on a particular trail beyond, what the trail itself would support, why those limitations would be in place. We do have a travel management process and we can certainly look at that. And I don't believe in a truly emergency situation that anyone would be trying to enforce limitations of what types of vehicles we could use on roads. We would use whatever access was necessary to get in and resolve the situation.
Follow up. So you have actual restrictions on entering the trails by a gate, let's call it, with a width that you can't get through. So you're not getting on those trails unless you jump over the rocks, which some people can do, but there's no easy access. They've been restricted to try to stop folks from just driving on them. So I think maybe you'd have to probably look at that too, maybe opening them up. But I'd certainly like to see our trails be more usable. And you've closed a huge amount of these trails. I mean, not you personally, but a huge amount of these trails have been closed throughout the years. Perfectly good trails that still exist. You can't go on them. I mean, I guess you could, but you get a ticket. So there's been a huge restriction already, just to say that up front. And, and I don't really understand the justification for that. but there's been a huge change in the past years of our access to traditional trails that do exist currently in the state of Wyoming. And so I look forward to, I guess, further information from you about why we can't, can maybe increase the size width requirement. Thank you. Deputy Director.
Deputy Director, any comment?
Thank you for clarifying the access issue with the gates. That would make it difficult to get through. We can definitely, there's a travel management process that's in place, and we can, through that process, take a look at the designations and address it that way. We can get you information on how that process works. With regard to the trail closure, is basically an issue with funding. We didn't have funding to be able to maintain all of the roads and trails that were existing. And so through that travel management process, they tried to identify the routes that were most important to leave open, as well as impacting people's ability to actually access property that they owned or important resources. Understand that it's not desirable, and we're certainly willing to engage through the travel management process.
Follow up, Senator Kolb.
Yeah, I think you could find the off-road community would be very receptive in dealing with, there's a funding issue with like timber that's down and you can't get access because of that. I don't think, frankly, I think maybe we could look into that to see if there's some partnership we could have. Because some of these aren't duplicitous. These are in fact unique trails that have been closed. I can show you where, but there are places that aren't duplicitous, just to be clear about that, Deputy Director. So I look forward to knowing more from you later on. Thank you.
Comments, Deputy Director?
Thank you again. That kind of partnership is what it would take to be able to do things like that. And that I think the agency has recognized that, and we're very willing to engage in those kinds of partnerships to provide the best access that we can and the best quality facilities and other to enable people to enjoy the land to the best extent that we can.
So as a follow-up to that, Deputy Director Okeson, the ORV sticker money is supposedly going to maintaining these trails and assisting with the funding. You mentioned funding as an obstacle. Could you tell us how much money you receive from the ORV sticker program and what portion of that goes to actual trail maintenance versus other things? I don't know what else it pays for, but maybe you could give us a little definition of what that money, how much there is and where it's going to be, where it's being spent.
Thank you. I don't know. We can find that out. I'm not sure. I don't know if Phil Osterly is aware, but we can certainly follow up with that information.
Could give us that information as a follow-up. I would sure appreciate that, because I've had a number of constituents that have asked, what is the breakdown of where this money is actually going? Because similar to Senator Kolb, we're getting a lot of conversation of we pay this money for ORV stickers, but we're not getting the trail maintenance that we expect. Thank you. Any other questions from the committee? Deputy Director, you mentioned that we had so many miles of trails. Has that increased or decreased over the past 5 or 10 years? And could you give us a percentage?
Thank you. I do not have those numbers in terms of percentage, but we can track on that. My guess is that it has decreased because of some of those travel management actions over the past decade. But I don't have those numbers currently.
Thank you, Deputy Director. If you could provide that as well, the percent of decrease, if it has decreased, what percent by what percentage? Thank you. Any other questions on off-road trails? Senator Kolb.
Mr. Co-Chairman. Another question that I thought about is, could you possibly, I guess, give some information about the percent improvement to access to these trails? I mean, we got a lot of trails. You gave us a lot of figures about how many miles you have in different areas, but could you actually propose a plan to make this better? To improve what we do have now. And I think the off-road community not to have a question here, but is very willing to do their part. I don't think the off-road community is asking you to pull out deadfall. You know, they'll probably take care of that themselves, but it's access. They need access to the lands, you know, action plan can we come up with and to set a goal. If I would like to, I guess, see what you thought about that. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Deputy Director.
Thank you. We can certainly talk with our recreation staff and get them engaged with the right partners to look at what it would take to, you know, what their objective would be and what might be doable. Again, there is that travel management process that is pretty rigorous, so we would need to go through that. But there are other types of improvements like the trail maintenance or maybe some of the changes in classification that we might be able to do without the formal full process. So we're happy to engage on that.
Any other questions? Deputy Director, e-bikes are becoming more and more popular, and I'm a little confused myself about where this fits into the trail program. There's some trails that are stipulated no motorized travel. Is an e-bike a motorized travel or is it not?
Thank you. My understanding is that an e-bike is considered to be motorized travel. I know they're looking within the, as you said, is gaining tremendously in popularity, and how do we accommodate that where it's not the same as like an ATV? So.
And I would like to interject that I've seen some of these trails that you have maintained and upgraded, actually. The Forest Service has done a very good job with that, and I appreciate that. I've used it myself, used a number of these trails that you have improved upon. So thank you very much for your stewardship in that respect.
Thank you.
Any other questions on off-road trails for Deputy Director Okeson? Seeing none, we'll open it up to public comment. We'd like to welcome Senator Stacey Jones here. Appreciate her being here. Any comments from legislators? Senator Jones, any comment? Any other agencies would like to comment? Please come forward and state your name.
Good morning, Chairman Dave Glenn, Acting Director of Wyoming State Parks and Cultural Resources. Within State Parks and Cultural Resources is our motorized trails program. Full-time staff and 16 seasons that go out and clear and maintain these trails. To answer Senator Kolb's question, I believe it was your question. This year, it was about $800,000 that we gave to the Forest Service. This was ORV trails for this summer alone. We have about 1,000 miles of width restricted trails. 50-inch and 64-inch on Forest Service lands, about 4,580 miles of non-width restricted trails. And this doesn't include some of the Forest Service roads that are enrolled as well. By enrolling these roads, by the Forest Service enrolling them, it allows us to go out and sign an MOU with the Forest Service to grant them dollars for law enforcement rangers, for borrowing equipment, for planning and other things. And that's about what that 800K went to. We're looking forward to the BT Forest, the Bridger Teton Forest revision, because I think we're excited about that. Senator Kolb, you also asked about the travel management plan and the number of trails. The travel management course has been going on for 7 years now. It's getting close to being finalized. There's been a lot of turnover in the Forest Service, and we'll actually see some of those width restrictions getting a little bit wider and changing a little on the Shoshone. And we hope to do the same on the BT when that travel management plan comes forward. And with that, I would just stand for any questions.
I knew there was a lot more intelligent people in this room than I am. So thank you for answering that question. Any questions? Senator Kolb.
Co-Chair, Interim Director. Restrictions on trail width. Do you have an understanding on what would be an impediment to increase those widths on those said trails, the 50 and 64s to a more traditional width?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, I can't answer that exactly because I think it's different at certain times, but it's really the process of going through that travel management plan in order to do that. Forest Service has rules that are set and in place. And for us, we've been working with the Forest Service to try and widen those road trails and actually take some of the width restrictions off completely. But it has to go through that travel management plan to get that done.
Follow up, Senator Kolb.
Follow up. Why couldn't we just lift all these width restrictions if it's able to be done on these trails? Because most machines now are 72 inches wide, right? That's typical, or wider, but let's just call them 72. And they're much safer machines. So it's a safety issue with people. It's a lot harder to tip them when they're wider. 50-inch machine will fall over pretty easily as compared to a 72. Overall, it's a safety issue and an access issue. And I think there's conflict with folks in our state and maybe out of state folks about these width restrictions. Certainly the 64-inch. I mean, that's a new one that I wasn't aware of in the past. But well, could we just have a blanket policy to lift this? If we're going to go in there and try to make a revision to this plan, that why couldn't we try to do it at a wider width? In other words, the default is a wide width and less restricted for some other good cause, something along those lines, instead of saying, oh, we're going to just, have to fight a battle with every one. Could we just have more of a blanket plan on width restrictions? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Director
Mr.
Linney.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, that's probably a better question answered by the deputy with the U.S. Forest Service on this. You put me on the hook. We'd love to have that conversation.
Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You just mentioned the plan revision has been going on for years. Why does that take so long?
Director.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, I can't speak for the Forest Service. I know from our perspective, they've had a lot of acting directors that come in, regional foresters that come in, and forest supervisors, I should say, I apologize, that come in, they're acting, they're not really ready to pull the trigger, then they move on somewhere else. There's also it's a broad array of diverse groups that are looking at this travel management plan. So when they come out with the options, everybody's fighting for their chunk of the pie. Us representing the motorized world, we're in there, we're in depth. I think we wrote 36 pages of comments and have been at every meeting. But it's just been, I believe it's more turnover than anything on the Shoshone.
Senator Ellis.
I think, Mr. Chairman, what I'm getting after is they follow a NEPA process. Is that right? Which requires scoping, alternatives, public comment, multiple year. So, something NEPA went enacted in the 70s, really good intention, but these processes can last up to a decade in some examples. Is that a fair assessment?
Deputy.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, you're dead on.
Any other questions? Co-Chair Boner.
All based off of that, and maybe for the Forest Service more than state parks. I know there's been a lot of talk about reforming that NEPA process, and even I think there's something in the debt ceiling discussion that made some progress. Is there any? I understand this is new and a lot of it's speculative at this point, but what right now, is there a possibility that could change? We can shorten the timeline for something like this. Even now, everybody's thinking about pipelines and transmission lines. With the discussions going on now, will this affect something like the plans for off-road recreation?
Director Wilkerson.
Thank you. Yes, there's certainly room for improvement in our NEPA processes. And I know the agency is looking at how do we streamline that? How do we do what's necessary? How do we leverage categorical exclusions when they're eligible, when those things are met? The challenge, I think, is what the interim director had mentioned is aside from the turnover, which is true, there's also just those multiple interests that come to the table when you open up travel management. And so you have some groups that think you shouldn't have any roads at all. And then you have some groups that, want to get out there and use the motorized vehicles. And so it can be a very polarizing thing. It gets pretty political, and it does take quite a while to get through the process, even if you do have leadership contiguously in place.
Sure.
And specifically, and feel free to, since this is brand new, it's just happening as we speak. have you been following the discussions that would shorten the permitting process? You know, is it be a change in the federal statute to shorten that process? Have you been following that at all? And if so, is it your understanding that the product of those discussions would affect what we're talking about here with off-road vehicle trails?
Deputy Director Okeson.
Thank you. So I am familiar with several new provisions that we've had with regard to NEPA and the wildfire crisis strategy and several other new categorical exclusions that have come forward to allow us to do that kind of treatment work. I don't work as much in the recreation arena, and so I'm not aware if there are specific proposals there, but I know broadly it's acknowledged that the NEPA process is very cumbersome, very bureaucratic, and takes a long time to accomplish the work that we hope to get done on the ground.
Senator Kolb.
This is probably a question for both. Is ask too much of a leading question here, but wouldn't you agree that the reality in the state of Wyoming is very different than other states, in that we have huge amount of open spaces, vast differences between those spaces, and that it more suits motorized travel, unless you're going to die out there. Or if you get hurt, you're going to be in real trouble. It's just that our distances are so vast out there. I think the balance is a little different. Honest, I mean, I certainly feel this way. The balance in the West is different than it is in more populated areas that there's more services closer by. So I think that's why the question is that's why it seems to lead more towards motorized travel than, say, walking. I realize everybody has a stake at the table when they talk about their needs, but I think that in balance, ours favors motorized more than, say, trail walking, especially for those vast. You couldn't cover those distances in a day. So would you think that we could shift the balance of the conversation to put it more heavily weighted towards motorized in the reality that we face in the state of Wyoming? What are your thoughts on that?
Which of you want to raise your hand on this?
I can take it first, and then if you'd like to comment. I appreciate you highlighting the safety issue. And I think through the process, the intent is to understand the unique needs of the community and to address those through the process. And so not at all opposed to, taking a look and understanding that, Wyoming is very different. It has its own unique character, and there are broad open spaces here that don't exist in many other Western states.
Interim Director.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a very interesting question, Senator Kolb. I'm one of those guys that loves to horseback in the backcountry. I also have a 1972 FJ40 that I love to go out in the backcountry with, and two Grizzlies as well. So for me, I think it's finding that balance, making sure that people have access to what they need and where they want to go, and prioritizing that access in those locations, if that makes sense.
Any other questions? So I've got one question. We've been working on a off-road trail system over here on the western side of the state, and Interim Director, you've been very involved in that, the SWAT. We're trying to link the one end of the state to the other, going north to south on this western side. So Interim Director, could you tell us what accommodations you're trying to make with this program that we're working on to be able to develop economic benefit and off-road trail system to be able to link up from Evanston all the way to Yellowstone Park? What kind of things have you seen that the Forest Service is doing to accommodate that, and what kind of obstacles do we yet foresee coming forward?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. Part of the issue is you're working with several different national forests when you're working on the Uinta, over to the BT and definitely when you start popping over the other side, you'll hit the Shoshone and some of those others. So working with different forests, sometimes can be difficult because they have different rules, different policies, different travel management plans. When they work through that, the Forest Service has been very good to work with initially on this process. As you know, one of the gentlemen that was leading the charge before he passed away was Senator Schuler's husband, retired Forest Service, and he was very instrumental in helping us get where we want to go. And the key piece for us is economic development for your communities. We want people in Evanston to be able to zip south to the Uintas, figure out how to get to the Wyoming Range, get over to the Winds, bop over to DuBois, maybe head over towards Jackson and do those types of things. So as we continue to work with SWAT and figure out exactly where their routes are, we're standing by their side, going and communicating with folks such as the National Park Service, Forest Service, BLM, and trying to figure out how to maneuver those trails and routes to get up towards Yellowstone.
Victor, do you see anything that the legislature could do to help with this process or help some of the obstacles that you're trying to overcome?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, the two bills that were passed this last legislative session that allowed some right-of-way access along the freeways and especially under the freeways was key. And also being able, once you enroll routes, which could be city streets and other things, requiring that proper safety equipment, which YDOT was it was very important to them and to us. Those two will really help us. Now, our next step is to work with SWAT to figure out those routes and move forward. So we may be reaching back out to you, but right now we're still just kind of figuring out drawing the lines on the map, if that makes sense.
Director, so you're seeing a lot of interaction with communities. They're very much in favor of this, are they not?
Mr. Chairman, absolutely. Many communities, Big Piney, Pinedale, I could go down the list. Evanston, many of those communities are starting to roll routes on their city streets, which allows people to come in, buy groceries, do other things, stay in their motel and actually drive their OHV to a restaurant instead of having to walk or drive a truck with a trailer on the back with their OHVs on the back. So they've been very, very gung ho on this.
Kolb.
Chair, Deputy Interim Director. Do you have the same positive approach as the past director did on off-road trails and the interconnection? And I would like to highlight the west to east connection from Evanston to Rock Springs. It seemed to be left out of the conversation. Do you have the same opinion about or the support for this program as the past director did?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, I can't say if I have the same amount. I would say if anything, I have more support. I think it's great to connect with Rock Springs. I would like to connect with South Dakota. I would love to see a non-motorized trail go all the way across the state, something that is a destination for a lot of non-residents to show up, start on one side of the state and spend 3 weeks to a month cruising across to the other side of the state.
Thank you, Mr. Coach. Yeah, and then just to comment about your other cities getting aboard, let's hope they don't do that before July 1. I think it's changed. I think is when it's effective. So good call. Interim Director, I'd hope that we work on one part of the state of Wyoming. Pick a part. I don't really care. You know, Southwest Wyoming is where it started. But we better figure out I think, could we develop a roadmap on how we do this? Because we're going to have to give some sort of guidance and help to those smaller communities at some point when they ask, well, how the heck do you do this? So I think I'd hope that you would be, proactive into developing a plan a model that we could give to these communities when they are trying to connect trails together to have a system. So it was first talked about between Rock Springs and Evanston. That's just it seemed to be a more doable first step, or go north, but I'd say that seems to be more doable. Would you be willing to, be proactive with that, developing some sort of strategy that the counties and cities and such can use to connect these different systems together? Because it's going to take cooperation, I would think, to have a trail connect to another trail going from county to county. What are your thoughts on that, Deputy Interim Director?
Interim Director Linney.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cole, yes, I think that's exactly where we need to go. I actually had dinner with Mark Tesoro with SWAT 2 nights ago, and those were the discussions we were having. And we were talking actually west to east. And I think what I feel we need to do is show proof of concept. So when I say I want to head this all the way to South Dakota, we're not going to start jumping on someplace in the middle of the state right now. If they want to go forward, we will help and support them. But we're really going to focus our energies on how do we connect the dots? How do we make this happen? It's going to take months to get rules created. We've been working with YDOT already, starting to have conversations to get rules created. And let's figure out where those under the freeway crossings are. Maybe there is a place where we need to go parallel with the freeway. Let's figure out and show proof of concept so Evanston can start seeing some benefit from it. Then let's start expanding the map as we move along.
Thank you. Any other questions from the committee? Thank you, Interim Director. Appreciate your comments and testimony. Are there any other who would like to give testimony concerning off-road trails here in the room? Senator Jones, thank you for being here. Would you state your name for the record, please, Senator?
AC Jones, Senate District 13. And I'm also a member of Sweetwater Snowpokes, which is a local ATV and snowmobile club. And I just wanted to say that we have a very good working relationship with the Forest Service. Our club has raised money and single-handedly built 2 safety shelters, and they're used year-round. They're very popular for everyone. But one thing I want to point out that the motorized community buys the ORV stickers. Non-motorized does not. So we do pay to maintain these trails. So we would like access to all of them. So I know Senator Cole mentioned that the clubs would probably work with you, and I know ours would. So also a lot of the state discussions, the motorized community is left out. We raise the money, a lot of the money, so we would like to be in the conversation.
Thank you, Senator Jones. That's a very, very good comment. Any questions for the senator? Thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you.
Any other public comment? Anything on remote? All right, see no comments. It's time now for a break. We will take a break until 10 o'clock, and then we'll resume with the U.S. Forest Service. Are we live? Okay, we'd like to reconvene the Select Federal Natural Resources Management Committee. And next on the agenda is U.S. Forest Service. We're going to discuss rights of way and permitting. Deputy Director Okeson, would you like to lead us off on that topic now?
Thank you. This might be the most exciting topic of the day. So the Forest Service authorizes special uses of land by individuals, companies, organized groups, and other federal agencies, state or local levels of government. Special uses contribute to the nation's infrastructure for generating and transmitting energy resources such as electric transmission facilities, oil pipelines, and hydropower facilities. The Forest Service also authorizes uses for communications, commerce, public health and safety, and homeland security, such as fiber optic and wireless communications, water development systems, and federal, state, and local highways. My understanding was that you all wanted to better understand the permitting process, so I can outline that for you. So it begins by submitting a request for a right-of-way access across National Forest System lands, as identified in the Forest Service regulations. The first step is typically to contact the Forest Service, usually at a district office level, for the area where the power line is proposed to be built. Applicants fill out a standard form, also known as an SF 299, and schedule a pre-application meeting to discuss the proposal, identify potential conflicts with the forest plan, to review timelines, fees, environmental compliance requirements, and other issues up front. After that application is filled out, the application screened against Forest Service regulations found in 36 CFR 251.54. And if it passes that initial screening, then it goes into secondary screening criteria. After it's screened there, the application is accepted. Cost recovery is estimated to process the application based on the level of environmental analysis required under the National Environmental Policy Act and in compliance with other laws such as the National Historic Preservation Act and the Endangered Species Act. An interdisciplinary team of Forest Service resource specialists, at times with the assistance of a contractor, will complete the resource surveys and reports to support the environmental analysis. The NEPA process then includes public involvement and coordination with other agencies, those that have jurisdiction or a special expertise in the area. Then following a decision, the special use authorization, a permit or easement, may be issued for the power line right of way for up to 30 years. And then the Forest Service and holder monitor construction in compliance with the terms and conditions of the authorization and decision document. That includes implementing biological and cultural resource protection measures, mitigation, revegetating areas of disturbance, treating noxious and invasive weeds, and implementing fire measures. Annual meetings are held with the owner or operator of the power line, and continued communication about the maintenance is presented and reviewed and approved by the Forest Service. And at the end of the term of the authorization, the permit holder may either request that the permit be reissued or submit a plan to decommission the line. So Forest Service handbook stuff, super exciting.
Director Okeson, any questions from the committee? Deputy Director, I've had some constituents from REA, local co-op. They say that they're having more difficulty getting rights of way for their power lines than in years past. Has anything changed that would have slowed this process down over the last few years?
Other than potentially staffing issues, we have had a lot of turnover, and so that may be creating, I know in that special uses area, there's been a lot of turnover, and so they may have new employees that aren't as familiar with the process.
You, Deputy Director, do you see anything changing that will speed up that process? Are the staffing levels going to continue to be a obstacle? Or do you think this will return to the way it's been in years past?
So we have been hiring, and special uses has been a place that we are hiring. And the other thing that we're doing is offering training from the regional office. Our lands program is run centrally. So we have experts in the regional office that can train the individuals and then serve as experts if they have questions, subject matter experts if questions come up. So hopefully that process, as people become more experienced, will play itself out. We're always happy if someone has a hiccup. If you all would like to reach out to me or have your constituents reach out, we're happy to get them in contact with the folks at the regional office that could, take a look at what's going on and what might need to happen.
Any questions for Deputy Director? One more question that I may have. We've seen a lot of emphasis on conservation in the last little bit as a component of multiple use conservation. Do you see that as something that may push out oil and gas and recreation or grazing per se, as we deal with conservation as a multiple use, which means conservation? That's one avenue that may be utilized to push out some of these other industries out of the forest. Do you see that changing the way we do business on public lands going forward?
So thank you. Through the NEPA process, we obviously have the opportunity for the public to weigh in and developing alternatives and commenting on impacts, and as a multiple use agency, all of those considerations are taken into effect. There certainly is a very vocal conservation community that comes and weighs in. We do have provisions in law that allow for things like livestock grazing, mineral rights development, those kinds of uses. And so I think it would be unlikely that they could rule them out, although I suspect that we will spend time talking about the environmental impacts and how we might mitigate the impacts of those kinds of uses.
Part of the conservation effort is restoration. So how does restoration fit into the current use of the natural forest, national forest? Will it create issues where we have to not only conserve but restore? And how are you managing that impact?
Thank you. So with regard to restoration, a lot of that work is work that we were talking about for forest health and to mitigate fire damage or fire risk. So I think that work is important, and to maintain forest health so that we don't get things like large patches of beetle kill that then become very dangerous. So that aspect of restoration, I think, if anything, would it's something that the agency is focused on and that we're working to address. I know, you mentioned recreation and the other uses on the land. I think everyone has an interest in maintaining the quality. Livestock owners, of course, want to make sure that they're, maintaining those pastures in a way that they can be utilized for generations to come. And I think the same with other users of our federal lands. They acknowledge that this can't be a short-term thing that we have to manage for generations. And so hopefully we can integrate that restoration and conservation aspect of things along with the other multiple uses that the Forest Service lands are authorized for.
The Director. Committee, any questions for the Senator Cole, please?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Specifically about conservation. Has your weighted scale for how you consider all those different aspects of, say, a project impacts, has conservation increased in the percentage of weight that you give to conservation as opposed to the past, where you had another policy? The policies, it looks to the public, has changed. The question is how are you weighting conservation now as opposed to your past methodology in how you were considering these different aspects of an impact?
Deputy Director.
So the itself has not changed, and we identify the issues that come into play and we have conversations. I think where you may see conservation getting greater emphasis is through the court system. For example, there are things like the Uinta Basin Railway, and that's in the state of Utah, not in Wyoming. But that decision was made to allow a special use permit for a railroad to build across land to transport oil. And immediately the Surface Transportation Board, who is the main sponsor of the overall project, not just us, was sued based on the potential impacts of greenhouse gases long-term effects on climate change and in other areas of the country. So I think some of those court type decisions are causing us to have to give consideration and do analysis around, what the long-term impacts of something is, and then how do we best mitigate for the uses that we're trying to accomplish. So I'd say the agency process has not changed, but we do see some emphasis coming in from the courts that direct us to either put things on hold or to take alternate direction.
Follow up, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. But this isn't the Supreme Court.
No.
No. So we really don't have this is a hot topic, obviously. And it's a battle because frankly, those environmentalist groups can shut down the country, shut down our oil and gas production, shut down everything with the smoke and mirrors of greenhouse gases and climate change. So it hasn't been decided by the Supreme Court. I would certainly hope that you would take that into consideration, that it's still not really decided, fully vetted law yet. I'll use that colloquialism. Thank you.
Deputy Director Okeson.
Thank you. Yes, it's district court decisions at this point, and we recognize that they may be appealed upwards, and we have to abide by the decisions or the stays that are issued by federal judges, but acknowledge that there's not been a final determination.
Any other? Representative Winter, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to kind of tag on to Senator Cole's comments relative to this conservation push. Does the Forest Service actively separate out preservation versus conservation in your management plans? We're going to be talking to the BLM here sometime today, and they are starting to, there's a push to allow conservationists or conservation groups to lease BLM land. And to me, that's just a preservation effort. It has nothing to do with conservation. And so are you experiencing any of the same things? And can you work towards identifying whether it's conservation or preservation in your management activities? Thank you.
Deputy Director Okeson.
Thank you. So with regard to preservation, we have the wilderness areas that were to preserve their condition. And so there's separate sets of rules that apply there. As far as environmental groups coming in and wanting to lease the federal land, we have seen some of that Teton and in other places where a conservation group may buy out a permit from a permittee. In those cases, the permits go back to the government. It's not as if they transfer ownership. The Forest Service still retains ownership of the permit, and then through an analysis process may determine to reissue that permit to other interested permittees. That's primarily where we've seen that kind of thing going on.
Committee, any other questions? Thank you, Deputy Director. We will open it up now for public comment. Any legislators or governor's office? We'll open it up to other agencies for public comment. Seeing none. Public comment from anyone interested in rights of way? Emily, anyone online? No. Deputy Director, thank you for being here. Is there any concluding statements you'd like to make at this time?
Thank you. I just wanted to express again appreciation for the opportunity to be here. I've been in my role for about a year and a half and have been working to build relationships in the state of Wyoming. So I appreciate the opportunity to understand more about what your concerns are and how we can partner to achieve the outcomes that we all hope to get from our public lands.
Thank you, Deputy Director. I appreciate your coming up to Wyoming. I've seen you here a number of times in Cheyenne as well as here, and I appreciate your efforts to let Wyoming have a voice as we manage our public lands. Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Okay, now we'll move on to the next topic on the agenda is BLM Public Lands Rule Proposal. And we have Adam Stewart, who's the Legislative Director of the Office of U.S. Senator Cynthia Lummis. He will be testifying remotely, is that correct? Okay. All right, thank you. Mr. Stewart. Thank you for attending the Select Federal Natural Resource Management Committee. Thank you for your service for the state of Wyoming. We'll open it up for your comments and appreciate you attending.
Thank you, Chairman Boner, and thank you, Chairman Heiner. Yes, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Chairman? Testing.
Can you hear us?
Yes. Can you hear me?
That's great because we can't hear you.
Okay. Not quite sure what the problem is. You still can't hear me?
Still nothing. You look all official and everything, but you don't.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. We can hear you very well, Mr. Stewart.
Perfect.
Thank you. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Chairman Boner, and thank you, Chairman Heiner and members of the Select Committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Adam Stewart, and as mentioned, I serve as the Legislative Director to Senator Cynthia Lummis in her Washington, D.C. office. Prior to working for Senator Lummis, I worked on the House Natural Resources Committee, the committee jurisdiction over the Department of Interior and the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976, of course, the topic of our discussion today. So on April 3rd of this year, 2023, the Bureau of Land Management published in the Federal Register a proposed rule called the Conservation and Landscape Health Rule. They gave it a 75-day comment period ending next week on June 20th, 2023. Under this proposed rule, the BLM would have several new authorities granted to them. These authorities include the ability to lease lands under new and vaguely defined conservation leases, expedite designations of new areas of critical environmental concern, or ACECs for short, apply land health standards to public lands, and incorporate new standards when evaluating traditional multiple use decisions. So let me be clear, Senator Lummis believes that this proposal is a radical departure from the law and flies in the face of 5 decades of public land management. This rule would stretch the original intent and meaning of FLPMA beyond recognition. Under the law, Congress requires the BLM to manage, and I'm quoting here, manage the public lands under the principles of multiple use and sustained yield. FLPMA specifically defines principal or major uses as limited to mineral exploration and production, livestock grazing, rights of way, fish and wildlife development, recreation, and timber. By proposing to add conservation as a use under FLPMA and defining conservation so narrowly as to only encompass restoration and protective actions, the BLM, in our view, is seeking to void their clear responsibility to manage the land for multiple use and sustained yield. Let me emphasize this. Congress expected conservation to be the natural result of managing the land for sustained yield. The establishment of conservation leasing program and significant expansions of ACECs are also very troubling proposals particularly because many of these proposals were similar to BLM Planning 2.0, which was overturned by Congress on a bipartisan basis in 2017. These proposed actions appear to be an intent by BLM to sidestep not only FLPMA, but also statutory mandates in the Mineral Leasing Act, the 1872 Mining Law, and the Taylor Grazing Act. So in her role as chair of the Senate Western Caucus and previous chair of the House Western Caucus, which collectively represents 128 House and Senate offices with members in the West, Senator Lummis will be pushing back on this rule with all vigor. BLM manages 244 million acres of surface land in the West, 99% of which are in 11 Western states and Alaska. 18.4 million of those surface acres and 43 million of the federal mineral estate are managed by the BLM here in Wyoming. So members of this select committee know better than anyone the impacts such a radical change will have on the landscape, on our economy, our industries, jobs, and much needed revenues to state and local government. Please be assured that Senator Lummis and indeed the federal delegation is united in opposition to this proposed rule. Senator Barrasso has led on legislation that would force the BLM to withdraw this rule. Senator Lummis is in tomorrow, and in fact, Governor Gordon is testifying at that hearing.
Questions? Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to be pushing back, I think vigorously, or I can't remember the word you used. What exactly does that mean? I'm guessing you've written letters, but is she planning on introducing a bill? I'm just curious if you could put a finer point on that.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, thank you for the question. With all vigor, I think was a term. So the first thing she did, of course, Senator Barrasso, he's in a great position as ranking member of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, of course, which has jurisdiction over the BLM, introduced a bill, and Senator Lummis co-sponsored that bill that would force the BLM, in fact, to withdraw this landscape and health rule. That's one effort, legislation forcing them to withdraw. Numerous letters have been written. She led a letter with Chairman Newhouse of the House Western Caucus, imploring the BLM to extend the comment period. As I mentioned, they only offered 75 days. Most RMP revisions offer 90-day comment periods. This rule, again, due to this nature of a radical departure from 5 decades of public land management, is woefully inadequate. There's incredible interest in this rule. Last I saw, over 86,000 comments have already been filed. So we're pushing on them, one, to withdraw. So additional stakeholders, groups can comment on this very heavy and significant departure from our federal land management. Other efforts, should the rule be finalized, of course, the Congressional Review Act, CRA, I anticipate that would be utilized. That, of course, grants expedited procedure in the Senate, lowers the voting threshold to overturn a rule. Hopefully it won't get to that point. Certainly, the appropriations process will be examined. It's difficult with divided government, but we'll use every tool in our toolbox to push back on this rule.
Any other questions for Mr. Stewart? Co-Chair Boner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just struggling to understand the potential impact of this rule. I mean, grazed, for example, due to, drought, or maybe there's a lot of wild horses, for example, overpopulation of wild horses, that the BLM currently has tools to say limit the amount of, AMUs that are in that area. Why wouldn't they just use something like that if they're worried about an area that's needs to be restored, or whatever the language they're using? Is that not adequate to achieve those goals if you need to reduce the impact on a particular piece of land?
Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Co-Chair Boner. That's a fantastic question. We would agree with you that the law seems very clear that the BLM has the tools they need now to manage the land for sustained use. That means perpetual for future generations. We agree with that mandate that our land should be managed with the future in mind. And to that end, we do believe that the authorities they have now, sans this rule, is sufficient for them to manage the land accordingly. And we do not believe that this rule is based in FLPMA, in statute, and in fact, an expansion of the authorities that Congress has very clearly given to them. And we believe they have the ability and authorities necessary to use of our lands as they exist.
Follow up.
Yeah, I guess just to take it a step further, it seems to me, and I just don't know what the plan is, maybe nobody does in this room, but do you, if this somehow goes forward and is found to be legal, would you imagine a circumstance where, say, a conservation crew could come in and get a grazing lease from a long-term rancher and maybe even in the checkerboard, at which point, you know, who's on the hook for fencing costs at that point? Who's, you know, it could completely destroy even the operation that has, you know, 50% private property and the other half is, you know, a BLM lease. And so I'm just wondering, how would you see this playing out if this rule goes forward? Is that what we're looking at, is a ability for a third party to come in and take out a grazing lease and say, you're not, we're going to treat this part holy site, part you know, museum, and we're not going to touch it, and that's what we call conservation, and kick out the long-term grazing lessee? Is that a possibility?
Mr. Stewart?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Co-Chair. I think it absolutely is a possibility, and some of the reaction from some of these conservation groups that are very much in support of the rule, it would seem to be that is in fact their intent. I think there are some users of federal lands that want to see preservation or the end of all multiple uses on certain lands, and this rule, should it go into effect, would probably be their strongest tool to accomplish that goal. So, you know, again, Senator Lummis is very concerned that, well, I will say, I think we will not be surprised to see legal challenges to this rule. I think that the FLPMS language is clear. The Supreme Court has said very clearly before, and I'll quote, the power to prescribe rules and regulations is not the power to make law, but the power to adopt regulations to carry into effect the will of Congress as expressed by statute. If you read the rule, BLM references statute itself. Any casual observer, even one that's unfamiliar, I think, with FLPMA or federal land management, would recognize that the language of the law is very clear. These lands should be managed for and those uses, the major and principal uses, in fact, as I mentioned, are actually spelled out in the law. Conservation is not one of them. Congress intended conservation to be the natural result of sustained use and sustained yield of the land. So again, I think there will be litigation to this rule, and Senator Lummis intends to do as much educating she can as a role as Senate Western Caucus Chair, and what powers we have legislatively to push back on this. Thank you for the question.
Mr. Stewart, the rule of law says that the lands should be managed for sustained yield. How can conservation or preservation be defined as sustained yield? I'm having a hard time understanding how that fits in with that rule of law.
Senator Lummis doesn't believe that the rule answers that question. There are so many outstanding questions, and that again, I think that again, unfortunately, it appears to us that the motivation for this rule is in fact and largely it's a result of their goal for this 30 by 30 push, right? Which Senator Lummis and others in the delegation have been asking and pushing back on for months. What does this mean? You know, 28% of lands are already federal land, and our ranchers, grazers, current users of land are active participants in the conservation of our federal lands, and that can be done respecting the law, which requires more. So it's a great question, and one that we'll continue to push to the Department of Interior to answer.
All right, thank you. Senator Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Well, Mr. Stewart, I have a question about how this may impact the minerals extractive industry and the uses thereof that they would potentially, it seems like they would lose. What are your thoughts on that? Is this a way to control the industry by having the possibility of saying that that the new terms they want to use to value a lease then be outweighed because of conservation compared to extractive, which is the bread and butter of the state of Wyoming. What are your thoughts on the potential impact to this change?
Mr. Stewart?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator. You know, these are the questions that our thoughts are that it does appear on development of our lands. You know, questions we'll ask is an oil and gas lessee paying to produce energy with the royalty to the taxpayer, and a hard rock mining claimant paying claim for maintenance fees, and a solar right-of-way holder is paying rent to produce energy. All of these uses on land, would the prospective conservation leaseholder pay to retire the land from those multiple uses? Again, that's a question that rule does not answer. Hopefully it's, you know, I know Pete Obermuller is speaking after me. He'll be able to speak more fluently on the direct impact, I think, on oil and gas. But it is certainly a concern of the senators that this rule will in fact be used to prevent those mineral and energy developments, you know, hard rock mining claims, even renewable energy projects for those that are opposed by some of these conservation groups, should that in fact be their motive.
Any other questions from the committee? Representative Winter.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Stewart, do you not think that this effort by this regime there in Washington is to advance the 30-30 land grab program that they're trying to get going? Thank you.
Mr. Stewart?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Winters, thank you. Senator Lummis absolutely does believe this is part of that effort, their 30 by 30 effort, or what they call America the Beautiful initiative. Again, they've never defined what conservation is in this 30 by 30 effort. And this proposed rule, we think, is the tip of the spear for that vague, undefined conservation effort of this administration. And again, it flies in the face of the law, of congressional intent, of 50 years of we think, successful management in many regards, balancing the multiple interests and multiple uses of our federal lands. And it certainly appears that this effort is one additional attack, frankly, on the West. Again, BLM lands, 99% of them are located in these 11 Western states and Alaska. I think many of our Eastern friends don't quite understand the challenges and difficulties that federal land management, in particular radical changes in that management, bring to our state and local governments, as far as revenues go, funding our schools, providing, you know, critical transportation infrastructure dollars, and of course managing our wildlife and recreation resources as well. No one loves public lands more than those who live, work, recreate on those lands in our state and in these Western states. We want to see healthy lands, and we don't believe this rule is accomplishing that goal. In fact, the opposite.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. The natural resources are very important to the state of Wyoming, as logically we get a lot of revenue off of that. We live here where half of the state is public lands. So this proposed rule will impact Wyoming tremendously. What can this committee and the legislature as a whole do to support our congressional delegation as you fight against this? Because we have your back, and we want you to know that we have your back. So what are some of the things we can do to support our congressional delegation as they fight against this new proposal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I want to make clear too, you know, we think that BLM, particularly at the state level, they've been great partners. I think that they share our goals and visions. I think sometimes it's political direction from Washington, D.C. That's where problems come. BLM Director Archuleta has been fantastic working with our office, and his team has been wonderful. again, I think that your efforts as a committee, having constant and consistent communication, outreach to state BLM, building that relationship and hopefully allowing as much work on the ground happening in Wyoming without political direction from Washington, DC. I think that's the most beneficial thing you can do for our efforts here. Continue to hold hearings, educate the public on these rules, encouraging comments. I know that the governor and state agencies, as much commenting you can on this rule and others goes a long way. I think that the groups you're hearing from after me, stock growers, Petroleum Association of Wyoming, supporting their efforts, particularly should it come to comments or litigation, that's helpful to our efforts. But I think educating your constituents as well goes a long way, and we certainly appreciate the leadership that this select committee has provided in working with our federal agencies that are so important to the state of Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. And I didn't in any way mean to disparage our local administrators, the BLM and the Forest Service. They're great to work with. They live here amongst us. They enjoy the outdoors and the public lands and recreation and multiple use as much as any of us.
Right.
But a lot of these headwinds are coming from the East Coast, from people that don't live amongst public lands, and they sometimes don't even visit the public lands, and they don't realize how much of our resources come from our public lands out in the West. So appreciate your efforts there on that end. Co-Chair Boner, do you have a question?
Sure, Mr. Chairman, a follow-up on that remark with I'm just wondering, Mr. Stewart, and the BLM isn't testifying on this topic because I'm a little concerned that they didn't have much input into this at all. So I'm wondering, are you aware, was there any interaction in developing this rule with the Wyoming State Office or any state office that's actually out here administering the BLM lands? What involvement are you aware of that they had in the crafting of this rule?
Mr. Stewart?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, co-chair. No, to our knowledge, this rule was developed behind closed doors, very limited outreach, certainly to stakeholders, to Congress. We have no knowledge of outreach to local offices in the West. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but we certainly have no knowledge of that. That's exactly why Senator Lummis and other members of the Senate and House are pushing so vociferously on the BLM to extend the comment period, to slow down and do some of this outreach and work. And going back to your comment before, Chairman, it's funny to me, one of my former bosses, the chair of the House Natural Resource Committee, he would joke, folks from the East think that a cattle guard is someone who wears a uniform. And I think that's educating our friends in the East about public lands, BLM, and many of those think that the BLM stands for Black Lives Matter. They don't distinguish between Bureau of Land Management and BLM. So there's a lot of education that has to happen. And we'd hope that the Bureau of Land Management in DC takes the time to listen to those on the ground, members of the House and Senate, the state legislatures, local officials, as this rule is so incredibly impactful on our way of life in the West, frankly. So.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Any other questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony. Please stand by. We may have some further questions as we receive testimony from other individuals, but thank you for your service there with our congressional delegation and your support thereof.
Thank you.
Mr. Magagna, you're next up. Please introduce yourself for the record.
Mr. Chairman, Jim McGaggan with the Wyoming Stockgrowers Association. Appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today and would certainly echo the comments of the previous speaker that that is the position that we hold with regards to this rule as well, and would add a few specifics to it. Our focus on this falls into two areas. One is what the impacts of the rule itself would be as implemented out on the land. The second has to do with the failures to follow proper procedures and laws in developing the rule to begin with. And I'll cover both of those briefly. I provided you with a couple of handouts. They're not pertinent necessarily directly to what I'm going to say now, but may be helpful to you. The first is an initial analysis that was done by our National Public Lands Council that highlighted some of the faults with the rule. We've now developed that into about a 9-page comment that will be submitted tomorrow with very complete details on that. The second, in an effort to get our individual members across the state, our ranchers, to provide individual comments, recently put together just a list of suggested items that they may want to raise in their comments. We've repeatedly encouraged them to submit comments by the deadline on June 20th. At our recent convention in Riverton, we provided staff with computers to take down oral comments, and we're putting those together now, and we'll be submitting those on their behalf as well. But back to the rule itself, one of the fundamental flaws that we see is the attempt to define conservation as a use of the land. Conservation isn't something new. It's an ethic. It's a philosophy about how we manage. Ranchers who've been on some of these BLM lands for over a century have always practiced conservation. And in the past, I would say 25 to 30 years, we've refined our knowledge about how to better accomplish conservation. We've become more vocal about talking about the conservation practices that have always been there. So it's a manner of using the land by those who are on the land every day, whether that be the grazing community, the energy community, the recreation community. It's what you bring to the land when you go out there. It's not something that be accomplished through a decree from Washington, D.C. One of my fears, if this is implemented, apart from all the other things that we're concerned about how it will operate, is that it will tend over time to destroy the conservation ethic. If I'm out there grazing all the time and I've taken responsibility for what happens, suddenly someone else is out there that's going to handle conservation. Over time, I'm going to lose my commitment to conservation, but I'm no longer responsible for it. It's being handled as a separate use of the land by a separate leasing arrangement. And I think that's a real risk here. Unclear in the document is who's going to do these conservation leases. As a grazing permittee, am I eligible for a conservation lease? Perhaps I would be, perhaps not. But is there anything that would be in it that couldn't already be done at lease without needing a separate lease? That's one of the many unanswered questions here. There's some language in there that says, well, grazing would continue. Well, it may, but if the grazing is in conflict with the conservation lease, certainly this regulation elevates conservation use to a higher level than the other multiple uses. So theoretically, at least, and most likely practically, between with any of the other uses as well. The two options I can envision, and I have a large BLM allotment that's about 60 miles north of here. And the two scenarios I can envision is either that my grazing lease is canceled because they issued a conservation lease, or they say, oh, no, they can operate simultaneously, and they issue a conservation lease to one of the groups that are out there whose total goal is to eliminate public land grazing, and we're expected to cooperate and get together out there and provide conservation. That's not the answer to keeping the other multiple uses viable, and it certainly is not the answer to accomplishing conservation. One of the other things that's in there that's caused some concern is currently for grazing purposes, we are subject to a set of land health standards that were established back in the mid 1990s by the BLM. Those were established with broad public input from our industry, and they guide decisions that are made on grazing on public lands. And our grazing permits are or leases are subject to us meeting those standards and guidelines. That's worked relatively well. There's a conflict now and then, but I'd say it's been relatively successful. And now they're proposing to incorporate those into this new rule to apply to all uses out there without any public input on them. And they just don't seem to fit there. So that is another concern there. Finally, the last one that I would raise a real concern is the language with regards to areas of critical environmental concern. Those have been around for a long time. We have some here in Wyoming. That program from the beginning was targeted toward a small parcel of land that had very unique characteristics. Might be an endangered plant. It might be a small population of endangered species. Some reason that needed protected. It might be some of its historic values or that, but it was relatively small to assure it received that needed protection. As we read this rule, the opportunity is there, and likely the intent is there to establish broad areas of critical environmental concern. Well, frankly, all of our public lands and our private lands and our state lands in the state are areas of environmental concern. That's the way we manage them with those concerns. But to segregate sections out under as an ACEC, that means that most other activities are going to be restricted out there. And not only energy development and possibly grazing, public recreation or ability of our game and fish department to manage wildlife. All of those are subject to constraints and restrictions under those types of designations. So from a practical perspective, we see this as a huge threat to our industry. We're submitting extensive comments, encouraging our people to do so. We're gratified for the congressional efforts of our senators and representatives to stop this. But we're also, as we develop our comments, we're doing so with the expectation that we could well end up in litigation with this. And certainly our industry, among others, will embrace that litigation vigorously if we're driven to that point, and would hope that the state of Wyoming, the Wyoming legislature would do the same. Let me turn now to the process a little bit. When you heard some references to that, I had the opportunity about a month ago to be in DC, and I visited briefly with BLM Director Tracy Stone Manning, and then she spoke to a group of us. And as she stood up in front of a group of us speaking, she with enthusiasm pointed out the fact that this rule was developed entirely in-house in DC. She said, we sought no external input. Well, that is unprecedented to me in how rules are developed. Since then, they've scheduled 5 public meetings out in the West. Well, 3 of the 5 were scheduled in Denver, in Albuquerque, and in, I believe Las Vegas was the other one, if I recall correctly. Not where the people are that are mostly they're on the land every day. 2 of them were virtual. I was not able to participate in them, but I talked with numerous people who did. It was made very clear in those meetings that the purpose of those hour-long meetings was for them to lay out their vision. They accepted no public comment. If people attempted to ask questions or comment, they were told the online process is available for you to do that. So very incomplete. We, along with, I know, the governor's office and others, have requested, one, an extension of the comment period that was mentioned earlier for at least another 45 days, preferably another 60. 2, that additional public meetings or public input be held in the West, and particularly in Wyoming, where the people who are out on the land doing whatever they do out there can actually be heard. We're now, 4 days away from the deadline. None of us had any response to those requests for either an extension or for additional public meetings. So I guess time will tell whether that even is going to happen. Looking at the process beyond that, and I believe the previous speaker mentioned Federal Land Policy Management Act, FLPMA, that it's a direct violation of the uses, the multiple uses of public lands that are outlined in FLPMA. We think it has some things in it that are a direct conflict with the Taylor Grazing Act, under which we have managed grazing on the BLM land since 1936. And that one as well. There was no NEPA analysis done under the National Environmental Policy Act. They specifically state in there that they felt that that was not necessary because it was not a major rule. I don't know how much more major you can get than something like this that basically turns land management upside down. Was mentioned, I believe earlier, the Congressional Review Act, which gives Congress a period of time that they can review agency rulemaking. As I recall, that applies if the impact of the rule is deemed to be $100 million or more. And in their, again, in their release, they say that the impact of this is far less than 100 million. Frankly, I could envision the impact being 100 million right here in the state of Wyoming, particularly with what could happen not only to our industry, but to the energy industry in the state. So in every way, they violated the normal process that administrations, both political parties, have utilized in the past for rulemakings. Normally in a rulemaking, there's an opportunity for cooperating agency status for county commissioners and other governmental groups. Now there are representatives from county commissioners here today. Perhaps they will address that for you. Normally on these rules, they get to a point where the governor has the opportunity for consistency review to assure that the rule, or point out if the rule has inconsistencies with state laws. To this point, there's no evidence that opportunity is being provided at all. So I think if it comes to litigation, the failure to follow with well-established processes will be the strongest point we have. But in terms of public comment at this point in time, I think what we really need to point out is how this rule, as it's envisioned and as it likely will be implemented, is the threat to the conservation that we all have been doing on this land and will continue to do, and that we strengthen every day. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to take any questions from the group.
Thank you, Mr. Magagna. Your comments are always well thought out and informative. Does anyone from the committee have any questions for Mr. Magagna? Senator Cole, please.
Co-chair. Mr. Magagna, this seems like your opinion. I think you kind of stated it. I don't want to, not ask a question here, but looks like a bait and switch operation. The federal government's coming in saying they're going to use it for this purpose, and that trumps other purposes. And basically, I think at the end of the day, it would look like it converts it into wilderness. It'll convert it into an area where we do not have multiple use. You don't have multiple use. The mineral extractive industries won't have use to it, and to their end goal of non-use, except for their supposed, smoke and mirrors use of, conservation. So would you think that was a true statement on the direction of where they're going with this, or what they'd really like to do at the end of the day from the federal government's point of view?
Mr. Magagna?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cole, I think that is true. And I'm even concerned that this is so broad, it could potentially go even beyond what we think of as wilderness. I mean, wilderness, there are a lot of activities can't take place, but you can walk in, you can have some recreational use in there, and that in wilderness areas, the Wilderness Act protected livestock grazing that existed at the time that the act was passed. I could see those things being lost. Here in Wyoming, we've got these wilderness study areas that we've been trying to deal with 25 de facto wilderness, because we haven't been able to move beyond getting them reviewed and either put in or taken out. It was an effort led by our county commissioners, and the state worked really hard on that the past 3 or 4 years. The result was some legislation that Senator Barrasso has introduced in Congress that's gone nowhere yet. So I do see that as a real fear. And wilderness is not always a bad thing if it's a vision of the people on the land. This piece we want to use this way, this other piece we're going to use in a broader, more multiple use way. I would go just a step beyond what you've stated, Senator Colvin. I could see this as being managed similar to wilderness, but being managed from Washington, D.C. Was mentioned earlier, and I visited with various people in the state BLM office, as best I can ascertain, they were not brought into this discussion at all. It was the director was being very honest. It was developed totally in-house in Washington, DC. And how we manage wilderness in Wyoming and how Washington, DC would manage that wilderness are very, very distinct.
Follow up, Senator Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Yeah, the Board of County, Sweetwater County Board of County Commissioners, in 2017, 18, my recollection is a little fuzzy from being a commissioner back then. We did make a recommendation to withdraw all WSAs in Sweetwater County. And the primary reason, number one, was they were so old. They were studied so many years ago. I think they're irrelevant currently. And so anyway, Sweetwater County still has a standing resolution. I'm sure Commissioner Richards could speak to this more accurately currently. But that's the history in Sweetwater for us. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your perspective as always and your work on behalf of the ag industry, Mr. McGagna. So in terms of, I'll ask Chairman Heiner's question here, what can this committee do? I think clearly, we still have, I think the comment period ends June 20th. It's, it takes a little effort to write a letter as a committee, opposing the rule both on the policy grounds and as well as procedural. But from the ag perspective, at least, abilities that you mentioned, either you lose your grazing lease and you just have a parcel of federal land that's just sitting there, at which point, from a practical perspective, you're probably gonna have to do some fencing, right? If it's adjacent to private land or other federal land that is not, that currently has grazing on it, right? If you want the livestock to actually stay off. Or in the case of where you have this sort of weird, the two groups that are utterly opposed to one another. Imagine in a lot of circumstances that conservation group's still going to have access potentially across the private property of the individual who they're trying to at least partially kick off the land. And so we have laws in the state of Wyoming dealing with fencing, who's responsible, who's liable, who's responsible for the costs. We have laws, to my knowledge, regarding access across private property to get to other private property, or in this case, federal land that third party has a lease on. So I'm wondering, from a legislative perspective, would there be something circumstances, these leases, in the off chance that it is somehow legal and the courts find it to be legal? Do you think we should protect our ag producers at least from, say, having to pay for half the fencing costs that a conservation group puts up to protect their new conservation lease? Is that something that we should consider?
Mr. McGagna.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Boner, a couple of thoughts there to come to my mind. First of all, depending on what part of Wyoming you're in, eastern part of Wyoming, they're relatively smaller parcels of BLM land. If you lost a lease, you could possibly be faced with fencing, because otherwise you would be in trespass on the public lands, and that would require, under no current provision in our law, can the federal government be required to share in those fencing costs. Between two private entities, they can be. So that might be something to look at. Coming over here to Western Wyoming, though, where the public lands are such a vast component of so many ranching operations, unfortunately, I fear what you would be facing is not fencing. You would be facing that those ranches were no longer viable. The livestock would be sold off and the ranches would be sold as pleasure ranches or subdivided. And because in this part of the state, ranching isn't viable if you don't have the ability to graze those public lands. So in either case, it's serious. Another thing that brings to my mind, though, because there are state trust lands intermingled with all of these lands. And if people were to lose their grazing permits, certainly state sections of land that are in the middle of BLM, and there are a lot of them over here, would no longer be viable to be leased for grazing. And so there's a loss of revenue there to the beneficiaries of the state trust lands. It might be another point to be addressed either in comments, or not sure how you would address it in legislation, but worthy of some thought. But it's just, there's so many ways that the relationship that has been built between the state and the Bureau of Land Management, that's generally been a positive one. We have our disagreements, but generally been positive. And I think it's been particularly positive in recent years with here and that would stand to be stretched, if not destroyed, by something of this nature. And we found this out on a number of issues that we've been dealing with BLM in the past 2 years specifically, that decisions that were typically made by BLM at the local level, by the state director's office, are now having to go to Washington, DC. And it seems like their ability to manage these lands based on the knowledge that they have, both professionally and because they live on the land, has been significantly diminished.
Follow up.
So often that my ignorance is on the trespass issue, with it, obviously on the east side of the state, we're lucky we don't have much federal surface, at least not in my neck of the woods. So how does that work? If it's a federal lease and say your sheep get out on somebody else's lease on federal land, is how that trespass issue or that liability issue be different than if that was private property? Could you, does state law govern in that case, or is there a federal law that would, require litigation using the federal law if you have a trespass situation where your livestock is constantly getting out on your neighbors and that neighbor has a federal lease?
Mr. McGagnon.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Boner, I'd want to do a little more research on that, but to my knowledge, there's no state law that would apply if you're trespassing strictly on BLM land. If you're a permittee on that BLM land, if you're a BLM permittee and you're allowing your livestock to trespass over to the neighboring permittee, one of the tools that BLM has is to reduce or cancel your lease. So they have that tool. Beyond that, it would just be a clear trespass action, and there are statutory provisions in federal law for various types of penalties for trespassing for whatever purpose on public lands. So those, I think, would be applicable there. One other thing I might mention, because I was thinking about it while your earlier speakers were up here, at least to date, this is not applicable to anything with the Forest Service. It mentions forests in the draft, but that's forested lands on BLM. It's strictly an invention of the Department of Interior, and Forest Service, being Department of Agriculture, has stayed away from it, and I think they're pleased to be away from it. However, again, if it's successful with this administration, I would not rule out that the next step would be to extend something very similar through regulation to Forest Service lands, and at that point, they've covered a good part of the state of Wyoming.
Senator Ellis.
Mr. Chairman, briefly, I always think of the impacted industries, and I know we'll have the Petroleum Association, but I think there have got to be other entities out there contemplating drafting a comment letter, County Commissioners Association. And so I'm thinking about the band, like, do you know of like an effort to get the band back together? Like, who's going to be chiming in with comment letters? I'm guessing the governor's office. We're probably going to contemplate having a letter drafted on our behalf, but can you give us a sense of who might be weighing in on this?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, there's a group of us who've been meeting periodically and working together on this, and that includes the mineral industry, mining, oil and gas, agriculture, County Commissioners Association. I've been a part of that. I'm trying to think who I may be missing there. But in addition to that, I know I've had some of the sportsmen's groups reach out to me and express their desire to work with us on this, because they are concerned that designation of an ACEC or issuing of conservation lease could well prohibit hunting and fishing on a particular piece of land. I mean, it has the potential at the extreme to stop all human activity. And so I believe the concern is very widespread, and I know some of those groups will be submitting comments as well.
Senator Ellis.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. Do you know if the Education Association or School Boards Association are contemplating writing letters? Because as was mentioned, this is our bread and butter for our budget. 70% of our revenue comes from oil and gas and mineral development. And when those years are rough, we see it first and foremost in education. So I'm always curious to know if, and maybe if you don't know that, maybe we can have a conversation of who might be a good spokesperson to reach out to them, because they certainly would be impacted. And that's something I've seen my whole time serving in the legislature.
Mr. McGagnon.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, I would certainly agree with you about those potential impacts. I've not had any conversations with them. I'd certainly be happy to do some outreach to them. One of the obvious challenges is that there's one weekend to get these comments together and submitted. Next Tuesday, I believe it is, but still worth that effort. And it does impact them from a revenue perspective. I know the governor's office is addressing the broad economic impacts in their comments, but comments directly from some of the education groups in the state would be very, very beneficial. In fact, any group that's dependent on state revenues, those revenues would be severely impacted if this were to be fully implemented across the state of Wyoming.
Any other questions for Mr. McGagnon? Representative Winter.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McGagnon, I'm encouraged that our congressional delegation is taking a stand that they are. But my question to you is, I guess, do you know how dedicated our governor is to standing up to this whole effort on the part of the government? And would it be wise for us to make a call to him personally to express our concerns? Thank you.
Mr. McGagnon.
Mr. Chairman, I said Winter, certainly communication between the legislature and the governor is very important, but I do know that he is very committed to this. I've had several visits with him about it. He spoke at our convention last week, and much of his comment was focused on how big of a threat this is to the state of Wyoming, not only in terms of our use of the public lands, but in terms of our revenue source. So I would have no hesitation to say that he's fully supportive and willing to take whatever steps would be necessary as we go forward with this, if it becomes necessary, including litigation.
Mr. McGagnon, if this is a veiled threat for our grazing industry, whereby they could actually force grazing off of federal lands, what impact would it have with our wild horse population? Would they be forced off of federal lands as well? Because as a rancher, you're well aware of the impact the wild horses have on conservation. Sometimes they're worse than cattle as far as the damage they do. So would this be a threat to our wild horse population on public lands as well if it came under a conservation easement?
Mr. Chairman, I think that thought has occurred to me, and almost it would be in some ways, but I think it depends on how they define for a particular area what conservation means. I mean, they could have a conservation proposal for public lands in southwestern Wyoming that would include a population of wild horses as something to be conserved, or they could draft it in such a way that the wild horses are a threat to meeting the broader conservation goals. I will say this, in several conversations I've had with the national BLM director, the current director, the one area where we seem to be in agreement, and she has shown some fairly strong interest in the need to deal with the wild horse issue. Unfortunately, to do that the right way, we need some congressional action, which is likely not going to come, but be that as it may. So it would depend on how it's applied. I mean, if you got rid of all the livestock grade to accommodate more wild horses, but they point out wild horses in large number amount of forage.
So as a follow-up, Mr. McGagnon, this could go either way with our wild horse population. They could remove cattle grazing and sheep grazing and make it a better playground for wild horses, actually increase the number of wild horses and call that conservation as we conserve habitat for wild horses. Or it could go the other way, where they would say that wild horses also create damage, and so we need to reduce the number of wild horses. So we're unsure how that could be utilized with this new rule if it comes to fruition.
Well, that is certainly true, Mr. Chairman. And another thing that's been talked about by some groups and had some support from the current administration, this concept rewire west, which means for much of it repopulating it with bison. They might decide, well, yeah, we're going to remove the horses because bison all over the public lands in Wyoming. I mean, it's just so broad. It's one thing if you have a rule that you can see how it's going to be applied practically and either say this is acceptable or this is unacceptable. The way this rule has been written at this point in time, it just leaves you free to use worst to the best.
Thank you, Mr. McGagnon. Any other questions from the committee for Mr. McGagnon? Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Obermuller. Would you state your name for the record, and the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Pete Obermuller, Petroleum Association of Wyoming. You would think after a number of years of doing this, I would remember that this is the only committee that runs ahead of schedule. So well done. I'm just gonna make a couple brief comments and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Colin McKee, who runs public lands. I believe he is waiting in the waiting room, and he'll offer a few remarks. I don't know that we need to add too much to what Mr. McGagnon said. There's really, I don't really see any daylight between Petroleum Association and the Stockroad Association on this particular issue. Just a couple of things, or just a quick thought. It's been mentioned, I think, by Mr. Stewart and others that the rhetoric around this rule has been about bringing conservation as a use on par with other uses, that somehow it's subservient to or subsumed by other uses. And I think they have it exactly backwards from our perspective, particularly in the 21st century, as what my former boss, Senator Lummis, used to call that we, particularly in the West, operate with a conservation ethic. That actually every single other use, from livestock grazing to oil and gas to mining to recreation, stems from the baseline of conservation. And we decide how to do these activities that maintains preservation as the baseline for future generations. So the notion of bringing conservation on par simply doesn't hold water to me in terms of a philosophy. I will say that this conversation is not new. The issue of multiple use of public lands has been debated and pushed back against since its inception. There are lots of efforts all the time to try to end multiple use, and I think probably the most recent one of which this is a part is sort of this effort that we are going to have to define what every single acre is. This acre is for you, and this acre is for you, and nobody, right? That's not multiple use in my mind. Multiple use, figuring out how we do it all together. There's tension there, but there doesn't have to be conflict. And unfortunately, I think a rule like this elevates the conflict. So with that, just overarching, and I want to turn it over to Mr. McKee to see if he wants to add any specific details related to oil and gas that Mr. McGagnon didn't already cover.
Good morning, Mr. McKee. Would you state your name for the record, and floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colin McKee, Regulatory Affairs Director with Petroleum Association of Wyoming, and I appreciate you all indulging me with being able to attend virtually. So I think between Mr. Stewart, Mr. McGagnon, and Mr. Obermuller, a lot of ground has been covered, so there's no need to really reiterate a lot of that. I think I wanted to hit on perhaps maybe just a couple of points that were somewhat touched on, but just make sure that we emphasize from oil and gas perspective, and I think largely from all the industries in Wyoming concerned. So we've talked about the intent of this rule and its goal to remove productive uses from federal lands. With the breadth, the extent of federal lands in Wyoming, PAW is very concerned about the effects that this rule will have on private property. Senator Boner, or Chairman Boner, I think you had mentioned that in so many instances, for private properties to function effectively or at their most economic level, that they have to intermingle. They have to get federal leases for grazing, for oil and gas development, whatever that is. Our concern is that with the strong conservation objectives of this rule, if the BLM is to shut down productive uses on their federal lands, that will reduce the economic opportunities on private property. And that is true for surface acreage. This rule states a number of times that the goals will be applied to all lands managed under FLPMA, and that includes the 43 million subsurface acres in Wyoming. And it's not very hard to contemplate a situation where a group requests a conservation lease on federal subsurface acres, making an argument, perhaps that the extraction of minerals will exacerbate climate change, which has effects to federal lands. And so the best use for those minerals is under a conservation purpose. So we have concerns about what this will do to both private property, surface acres, but access to federal minerals. The last point the other point that I'd like to make is a procedural one. And I think Mr. Magagna hit on this a bit, but BLM is claiming that this rule will not have an effect of $100 million or more per year on the economy. And they've also issued it using a categorical exclusion, whereas typically this would go through a more broad NEPA process. Again, the inherent outcome of this rule is to reduce economic activity on federal lands. And last year, the BLM's own analysis showed that federal lands generated over $18 billion worth of economic activity in Wyoming. And so if you inherently start to chip away at the ability to do that, it's hard to put a hard number on it, but it's going to be something greater than $100 million in Wyoming, and certainly economy-wide. I think their attempt to do that was to circumvent possible review under the Congressional Review Act. So we've been trying to really hit on that, and also hit back on the BLM for issuing this as a categorical exclusion and not through what we would hope would be an EIS, where we can analyze a bit more how this would play out on federal lands. One of the things that makes it hard to imagine how this rule will work is the BLM doesn't really provide any idea of a scope of how any of these things will apply. They talk about preserving intact landscapes for conservation purposes, but they don't put sideboards on what intact landscape is, whether it's an acre or 1,000 acres or what. They're now allowing for every federal acre and subsurface acre to be leased for conservation purposes. They've lowered the bar and want to reprioritize designation of ACECs. So without understanding the breadth, it's hard to really estimate what the economic impacts are, but I think the ambiguity brings a lot of concern from us. But like I said, I think a lot of ground's been covered. I appreciate the indulgence and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. McKee. Any committee, any questions for the PAW, either Mr. McGee or Mr. Obermuller? Co-Chair Boner.
So and I appreciate the comment about it's really ambiguous how this could actually be implemented, but it would help me at least if you could, kind of theorize some of the ways specifically that this could be used against the oil and gas industry. Would this be something where a third party comes in, say, if they have another oil and gas lease like they're supposed to, go out and say, actually, we want that lease, we're not going to develop it, and go out and start to compete in those oil and gas leases? What are the vulnerabilities, I guess, within the federal process currently? And that would help me understand some of the potential threat here.
Mr. Obermuller?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Co-Chairman. I'll get into it a little bit more in this afternoon when we start talking about leasing, but I think probably is better than anybody. when the BLM leases for oil and gas, you would think that they would do is look at a project area and lease the area. They lease in tiny little blocks all over the place. These little blocks this year, these little blocks next year, maybe, under this, and it's not a system. So you have to build over time what the BLM is willing to put out on the bidding, put out for leasing. So it's not uncommon to have a company that has an entire area under lease, except for literally like 360 acres right in the middle, and everything else is surrounded by their lease, but this one is not. And that really disrupts the whole drilling program. So as Mr. McKee was saying, you would think that they wouldn't look at that and say, well, we're going to do a conservation lease on that land. Or as Mr. McKee pointed out, which I think is an important point, is that there's nothing in the rule that says you couldn't lease the subsurface for conservation. So leasing the subsurface for conservation and thereby making that pretty much that entire project area worthless. Now, you might say, oh, come on, that's crazy and exaggerated. I think I would say that too, except for the repeated public comments of this administration about wanting to end oil and gas production on federal lands. We know that just banning it outright is not possible. It's not going to happen. How is it going to happen? Little things like this. So, I don't want to put on my tinfoil hat about this, but it's certainly possible.
Any other questions for Mr. Obermuller or Mr. McKee? Mr. Obermuller, this administration is pushing for conservation, but we're also seeing a push for carbon capture and storage. And I see these two emphasis that they could go against each other. For example, if we want to have a carbon storage field in Wyoming, yet this conservation rule becomes real, whereby the surface is conserved. In order to have a storage field, you have to have monitoring wells and injection well, some of these disturbances. So I can see these rules going head to head and being pushed in opposite directions. You can't have conservation as well as carbon storage, and Wyoming is a prime location for carbon storage. So do you see this as being a problem as well, or am I just up in the night?
Mr. Chairman, hard to say. I mean, right now, obviously, as you pointed out there, the administration, but also Congress is putting both laws and other regulatory practices in place to incentivize permanent storage in particular, not so much enhanced oil recovery, but permanent storage. So, I mean, my honest answer is I think they would probably try to work out those conflicts. You would think, but again, as you've heard over and over again, if conservation leases preclude every single other use, then you're exactly right. That means every use. That means recreation and carbon storage and everything. It's wilderness plus. Could be theoretically wilderness plus.
And as a follow-up, Mr. Obermuller, the carbon storage field we know is integrated in the reservoir, and particularly down here in Southwest Wyoming, where you have the checkerboard. If the federal government decides they're not going to allow any carbon storage on their portion, it basically precludes the private section from having that opportunity as well. Could that be actually a takings if they did that?
Mr. Chairman, I am not the guy to answer that question about whether or not it's a takings, but you are right that particularly in checkerboard, if the federal government decides not to participate, that very much limits private landowners' opportunity.
Thank you. Any other questions for? Thank you for being here for your testimony. We'll hear from you later on this afternoon again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your time.
Now we'll open it up for public comments. Are there any legislators or government officials that would like to testify? Any other agencies? Any public that would like to comment? Please come forward and state your name for the record.
Good morning. My name is Micah Christensen. I am the Natural Resource Counsel for the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. And I appreciate the opportunity to address this committee on the Conservation and Landscape Health Rule from the BLM. You've heard already a little bit from other associations in the state talking about comments and some indication that maybe the County Commissioners Association should also be participating in those. Proud to say that we are. We'll be submitting comments by the June 20th date. We've also submitted letters to the Bureau to request an extension to that public comment period and have encouraged our individual counties to submit letters on behalf of their constituents as well. The Wyoming County Commissioners Association represents all 23 of Wyoming's counties and 93 of our elected county commissioners. We don't always agree on everything, but in a lot of ways, we do agree on significant portions and concerns regarding the proposed rule. First, though, I should say we're not speaking out against conservation and land health. We're actually very pro land health. We're very pro conservation, and we have seen great examples of not only our counties, but our association working with the Bureau of Reclamation, or sorry, the Bureau of Land Management. Probably Bureau of Rec too, but in this case, Bureau of Land Management on projects to directly work towards conservation across not just public lands, federally owned, but state and private lands as well. One initiative, WCLI, the Wyoming Landscape Conservation Initiative, is a long-term science-based program that's directed towards making sure that we can have both healthy ecological areas for wildlife and recreation, but also balance properly other uses that we need to have on our lands. There's 9.3 million acres of BLM land in that project area, and there's another 10 million acres that aren't BLM owned lands. So in this case, we're allowed to work with the BLM to do truly a landscape scale investment, not just in research by federal agencies and state agencies and nonprofit or non-governmental organizations, but a true landscape scale approach on addressing issues that are impacting our public lands. Additionally, it turns out to be a pretty good deal for the BLM. For every dollar that they invest into WLCI, $3.32 has been contributed from other partners. So the BLM money is going further to make real impacts on our state and on our lands. But jumping into the rule, I think you've heard already quite a bit about how the rule unnecessarily pits conservation against other uses instead of harmonizing those uses. And part of this has been driven by process. I don't want to repeat everything that's been said, but there's been no scoping. There was no stakeholder involvement, no conversations before the Federal Register hit and public comment period starts. There's a limited 75-day comment period with 5 public meetings, 3 of which are out of state, and the other 2 were online where you couldn't ask any questions, right? This is not show good faith on behalf of the Bureau to participate and cooperate with not just local government, but all stakeholders of our public lands. And then most importantly, in our opinion, is the lack of any NEPA analysis outside of the categorical exclusion. We believe the proposed rule should provide an opportunity for meaningful local government participation prior to its adoption. The proposed rule actually cites to and give lip service of, quote, a collaborative approach to natural resource management, specifically citing change on America's water, land, and other natural and cultural resources, which requires the Department of the Interior to work with local governments to, quote, develop landscape scale level strategies for understanding and responding to climate change impacts. That's one of the driving principles or one of the driving problems for this rule is to address that. And yet DOI doesn't actually go about following their secretarial order and working with our local governments. The rule also doesn't cite Executive Order 13352, which instructs the Department of the Interior to implement laws relating to the environment and natural resources in a manner that promotes cooperative conservation with an emphasis on appropriate inclusion of local participation in federal decision-making in accordance with their respective agency missions, policies, and regulations. So just like you, we've prepared a slew of questions that we'd like to ask BLM. Unfortunately, we're afraid they're going to go unanswered. And I'm guessing a lot of the questions that you've asked today will also go unanswered because the dialogue we've had today is probably more substantial than what we've heard from BLM headquarters thus far. We've requested that the BLM not rely on a categorical exclusion. This is not simply a administrative, financial, legal, technical, or procedural rule in nature. This proposed rule sets goals, standards, and methods for how public lands are to be managed. The rule presents a substantial departure from past interpretations of BLM's responsibilities under FLPMA, and it also establishes a precedent for future action and represents a decision in principle. The heart of the proposed rule is to clarify that conservation is a use on par with other uses of public lands under FLPMA's multiple use framework. However, as you have heard already, this isn't so much a clarification as it is a rewrite. But county commissioners are not just complaining about the rule. We are offering to work as cooperative land health needs across our state, including the threats from invasive species, drought, and wildfire, and other issues of impacting our public lands. Commissioners are able, willing, and legally authorized to meaningfully participate with the BLM, to engage with the BLM, and they do it for free. We just need federal agency leadership to act. Referring back to previous questions, we are very much so engaged and hope that the BLM takes our comments seriously and restarts the process, full NEPA, and allows for public input prior to the rule being finalized. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Christensen. Any County Commissioners Association, Mr. Christensen? Representative Winter, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sir, as the County Commission Association, have they been in touch with the governor at all on this? Are you actively working with him to accomplish this goal or to accomplish our goal of remedying this rule?
Mr. Christensen.
Chairman Heiner and Representative Winter, thank you for the question. I believe it was Senator Ellis that mentioned earlier, have the associations of the state sort of rallied together and had discussions? The answer is yes. So we have had communications with other associations of youth, and the governor's office has been engaged in those conversations.
Any further questions for Mr. Christensen? Seeing none, thank you for being here. Thank you for representing our counties.
Thank you.
Any other public comment? Emily, anybody online? Okay, with that, we'll close public comment. Committee, what's your pleasure? Coach.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee send a letter as part of this public comment period, which ends on June 20th. That summarizes what we heard here today: universal opposition to the policy and universal concern about the procedure, and go like.
Do I have a second? Seconded by Senator Ellis. Any discussion? Seeing your willingness to vote at this time, all those in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Same sign. All right. Emily,
just so we're all clear on exactly what you guys want to be included, since it's a really tight turnaround. So.
And we'll have a very quick turnaround for this. Yes. So once we get that drafted, we'll pass it amongst the members of the committee. And so be watching for your emails, and we'll get that drafted as quickly as possible. Now, will that go out under the chairman's signature, or will all of us need to sign?
Only 6 members. I'm sure all of us could sign it, Mr. Chairman. Whatever the committee's pleasure is, I guess.
Okay. All right. Senator Cole, please.
Mr. Chairman, is this gonna go up? We're gonna get it done. Okay, just want to make sure we don't miss our commenting period.
Unless we have to wait for one of us to, yeah.
Well, snooze, you lose. Thank you.
Senator Ellis, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think since we voted on it, if you two wanted to sign it and you say on behalf of the committee, I think that's fine. I just don't want to cause delay.
That would make it go faster. Yes, Senator, thank you. Any discussion about that, letting the chairman?
Mr. Chairman, I agree totally. You guys, I mean, you might send it to us so we can give you our thumbs up, and I say we move quickly if possible.
Okay, thank you, Representative Tarver. Business, we will adjourn until 1 o'clock. Thank you very much for your participation. I think it's been very informative.